Welcome to Apodcast with interesting people. I'm Adrian Sinclair, and today my guest is Angie Toone. Angie is a platoon leader with Utah Battlin Betties organization, an organization whose mission is to honor and serve our nation's military, veterans, first responders, and their families by supporting and creating unique programs to help them out. Some of those programs are a community outreach, PTSD and suicide awareness, and those are some of the topics that we're going to be talking about today. Hello, Angie. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Thank you for being on the show, and being patient with me messing up your name in the intro, which we had to reshoot. So you guys just didn't have to see that. So that's good on that account. So you're here because we got connected through Oric, who's running the ketamine clinic over here in Utah, and he. I'm on a mission to tell the story of a lot of veterans, and you're a wife of a veteran, and we're going to talk about your experience and his experience and everything that you do in this space of supporting our veterans and first responders and others that are dealing with life issues.
Yes.
So welcome to the show.
Thank you.
So tell me a little bit more about what you do at Battlin Betties. And you also are involved in the Elizabeth Dole Foundation.
Yes.
And so tell me a little bit more about that.
Okay. I'll start with Battlin Betties. So we're a national organization, and we're in, I want to say, 25 plus states, but I run the Utah Platoon. I'm also on the national board. So I'm involved on both the national level and the state level. And we support military, veterans, first responders, and their families. And it's an amazing organization. The thing that makes it really unique is we dress from the 40s and 50s at all the events that we do. And that helps just kind of promote patriotism, kind of kick back to the time when our country was really patriotic, when everybody pulled together. When the country was at war, we were all at war together. And so that's why we dress from that era. And it really adds something to the events that we go to. The veterans love it. The public loves it. We are crazy busy. We're at the point where we don't even look for things to attend anymore. Like, we are requested at events, which is amazing. We work with all of the big organizations, the VFW, the American Legion, the Elks, the vet centers. They want us out and about with them, helping to reach the veterans, bringing veterans in. We do a lot of service wherever people need extra hands with service projects. We don't mind throwing on our jeans once in a while and getting our hands dirty. We also host some of our own events. Every year we do a big retro pool party for women, for caregivers of veterans and female veterans. And it's an amazing event everyone looks forward to every year. And so we're just out there all the time. Right. Last year we did over 60 events. This year. Wow. We are on track to do even more. We do a lot of public awareness for PTSD, like what it is, what it is not. It is not what Hollywood tells us it is. Right. And so that is something. Most of the ladies on the platoon are either married to a veteran, they're veterans themselves. We have ladies that are currently serving. All of us are connected in some way to our mission, and so we're really passionate about it.
How long have you been doing it?
So we've been in Utah for 4 years. I think I started the platoon here in Utah now, and it's just, we just hit the ground running, and it's been amazing. It's a pretty fabulous thing.
So tell me something about the programs that you guys are running over there. Like, some of them are the PTSD and the awareness around that. What else is
so happening? Every time we do a booth anywhere, we have resources set up for veterans. That's kind of our main thing, is making sure that vets are getting the help that they need and their families. So one of the things that we did is we actually gathered all of the top resources in Utah and compiled them into one place. And they're it hasn't been there before, especially not accessible. So we've actually put them in places like the VA clinics and the vet center, and then we have them at all of our events. And so when we meet someone, especially someone who is a veteran who isn't getting services, or a family member who is taking care of a vet and who isn't out there getting help, then we've got all of this compiled into one. And it's everything from VSOs, veteran service officers, a lot of people don't know what that is, to recreation organizations, to caregiver groups, everything all in one place. And so we can talk to, in Utah, it seems like the most common disability for veterans is PTSD. We don't see as many physical disabilities around here. So we bump into these veterans and their family members, and we've got all of these resources in one place. We also, our entire booth is covered with things like magnets with the suicide hotline. We have vet center information. We've got everything that they need. And it's interesting because we're women and we're dressed fun, we're really approachable. And we have a lot of veterans that will come up and they'll share their stories, things that they don't share with other people. They'll share their combat stories. They'll talk about their depression, things that they don't usually talk about. And they open up. I have seen so many big, tough vets shed a tear as they're sharing their stories. And I'm able to say, you know, I'm the full-time caregiver for my husband, who's a Marine Corps combat vet who suffers severely with PTSD, with moral injury, with so many different things. I've been there. I sit there next to him when he's going through flashbacks. I've been with him as he's going into the psych ward over and over and over. And as I'm sharing my story, these veterans feel I'm a safe person. Yeah. And they open up. And I'm like, you know what? My husband hates counseling with a passion, but he goes because it's important for me that he goes. And I bet you have someone in your life that would appreciate if you would go. And next thing, they're taking the information from me. And it's a different aspect and a different perspective that these people are getting, and we're able to reach them. And that's why, like, the vet center likes us to go, because veterans will walk by and you can tell they're veterans because their hat or whatever, and they see the big mobile unit that says VA on the side. They're like, no thanks, I'm good. But you put us out in front, and next thing they're coming up and they're like, so what are you ladies doing here? And they're opening up and they're shedding a tear, and next thing they're signing up for services. That is just so amazing. It's all about context, right? And so I can relate to what you're saying, because even like doing this podcast and the long form in which this is happening, where we just talk. This is not an interrogation. It's not a bunch of questions that are lined up. It's just a conversation. Yes. And then when you give people time and context, they will peel off those layers, and you will get to know them better. And I think that's the beauty of it. So what you gals are doing, creating that sort of like safe space is just critical, because like once people start opening up, then you have that you have that access, and they are willing to continue and do something, versus like, oh no, I'm a tough guy. Yeah. I can handle it. Like, I'm not broken. I'm fine. Right. Yeah. And so perfect. So that's yes. And I've had awesome so many women that just break down and start bawling, and they're like, I don't know why I'm crying. I'm like, I know why you're crying, because you found someone who relates to you. Right. So many caregivers don't even know that there's a whole bunch of other caregivers in our area, and I'm hugging them and they're just bawling. And it's funny because my daughter, actually, she's 20 years old and she volunteers for our organization as well. And she has PTSD and depression and anxiety and panic disorder and all of these things. And so she suffers, and she doesn't like people to touch her, and she has all these same issues too, right. Obviously not from the military, for something else. And people will come up and start sharing their stories, and she almost like panics. She's like, let me get my mom. And she's like waving me over, and she's like, she can tell like this person wants to relate. She's like, I am not the person to like hug you, and she can give them the resources, but once it starts getting touching feely, she's like, oh crap, I need my mom. And I'll come over and I'm hugging them and everything. And it's so funny because like she gets this deer in the headlights look, and she's like, oh no, like I can tell this person wants a hug and they want sympathy, and I just want to run and hide under the table. So, and it's, and we do attract some of the people to our platoon that have their own mental illness issues. Like some of them, when they apply, will say, I have depression, and so that's why I want to volunteer in something that is so heavily involved in mental illness issues. And they're funny because they have the resources, but it's kind of like they don't quite know how to do that. And so we have the lady, like we've got one lady on our platoon that is a therapist. We've got some that run their own nonprofits on the side. Like a lot of us have the experience, and then there's some that know when to grab one of us with the experience.
Right. Now this is an interesting approach, and clearly it works, and it's great that you know who started Battlin Betties.
So there's the CEO is actually in Texas, so that's where the
organization, the
headquarters is in Texas.
Right.
So it actually started under a different name a few years ago, and then it morphed into this. It used to be called Pinups for Patriots. So a lot of people were familiar with that, and it was started years ago. And they wanted an organization where women were empowered and dressed in the pinup style, but were doing good.
Right.
And so a couple years ago, it switched names. The person who runs it, she is married to a veteran with PTSD as well. And it's just amazing women. It really is.
Yeah. At first, when I saw the website, I was like, wow, this is a little bit risque, maybe from like kind of like pinup perspective. But then what you also tap into is the feeling, the patriotism, and going back to like last century, going back to World War II and all that stuff was happening, and what that carries, the greatest generation, and how that had a place, and how that did help the soldiers, all that, and you kind of guys are echoing from that point on, and
yeah, and that's the thing is we really try to, like, we have strict dress standards like a lot of pinup organizations don't. So we've got some pretty strict dress standards, but people hear the term pinup and they're kind of like, we actually like the Utah Battlin Betties, we host the pinup competitions in Utah at things like Sounds of Freedom that's coming up, the Fort Douglas I guess it's called Fort Douglas Days, but different military events, they have us host those because that was part of military history. So it still falls under our mission. And we've actually started doing some of the men's competitions in Utah, which is unique to anywhere in the country. And that is because back during World War II, and even still, because military men are obnoxious, that's something that they would do to blow off steam. Like during combat, there's so many pictures during World War II of men in hula skirts and women's hats and just goofing off, and they would compete and be silly because you can't be all war all the time.
Right.
And so we actually do that at some of our military events. We'll have a men's competition, and they get all silly in their vintage uniforms, and it's a huge part of military history that people aren't aware of. Is they couldn't be fighting all the time. They have to do something to be silly. And, and I talked to my husband, like when we were first talking about this, we're like, is this something we could do? Like would people love it? And he's like, he was in Iraq in 2003, and he's like, we were doing the Arabian Lady, and like people are still doing it. They still, wherever they're stationed, they're dressing up, and and it's just a way for them to bond. And so it's, it raises awareness. It brings people out to some of these military events that maybe we're getting kind of old and stale, kind of bringing the older men crowd, and now it's bringing a younger crowd in to hear about military history and be able to share some of that. And so we host those, which are, they're fun, but it also raises awareness.
Right. So let's talk about awareness and some of the programs that that you guys are doing over there. Awareness around PTSD, awareness around anxiety, all those things that are happening right now. So I have a kind of like twofold question. One is, from your own perspective and your own experience, why do you think there's just so much more of that happening right now? Anxiety, not only PTSD kind of, we get it, especially with veterans, exposure to combat and all of that, but only regular social anxieties that we have in regular, citizens. What is your theory? What's happening over there? Because it seems like there's just more and more of it.
There does seem like there's more of it, and it's just crazy. I think a big part of it is just our culture in general now. We're not around people as much. I think that we're really disconnected. Like in the past, we just grew up having to be around people. You grew up having to learn how to talk to people, and it was just pushed on you. There wasn't this, oh, well, they have anxiety, so they don't have to do this. And you grew up learning how to answer a phone and how to make a phone call and how to knock on someone's door and how to have personal conversations with people. And these are things that we're taught from the time you're little. And it's the more we're disconnecting from people, the scarier it gets to be around people. And I see that all the time. Like, we're sending now adults off into the workplace and they don't know how to answer the phone, and it freaks them out to take a phone call because they've never had to do it. They've been on a computer, they've been texting. And so people have all this social anxiety because they don't know how to connect with people on a personal level. It's all their connection has been done through technology. Like my kids are all adults, and it's just crazy. Like, they'll have people that they date and all of their communication has been done through things like texting and chatting online, and then they might occasionally hang out, but they're not even going on dates. They don't have to do the whole pick you up and take you out somewhere. They just get together and put on a movie, and even they're dating, they're not communicating. They're just watching something on technology. So we don't have that interpersonal relationship like we used to. And so it's scary to people because people are scary. Like, what if they judge you, or what if you mess up? But we of a different generation, we all had to learn how to do that from birth. And you no longer have to do that. So it's scary.
That's a really great point. Technology is such a double-edged sword in many respects, right? It allows you to do all these amazing things, connect, and at the same time it disconnects you, right? It can connect you with someone on the other side of the world, and at the same time disconnect you from the closest people around you, because you have that barrier, you have that tool that just, that allows you to do that, and it's it's such a huge topic, but I think that's such a valid point. And then the other side of that is, how easily is it to judge other people or like look up certain standards? Like people are just like constantly judging themselves. Like, oh, look, this person is so successful. This is what it means to be successful. This is what it means to be successful because of that easy exposure through technology, right?
Yes, and it's. Doesn't matter how, because I'm someone, like, I was a blogger and then I'm big on social media and I have a lot of followers. Like, my kids kind of grew up in the social media light, and it doesn't matter how open you are. It's like people put you up on this pedestal, and that's something I actually work with my therapist on this. And so I'm like, it's like crazy that it doesn't matter how open you are. I will post about our most horrible days and my messy house and how my kids ate cereal for dinner. And people are just like, you're just so amazing because you're so open. And it's like, it's like people just look at social media and they just think that you're better than, and I'm like, dude, like, look at this. I'm posting like how messy this is, and people are just still like, oh, well, you're just so much better than me because you can show your messy house. And I'm like, or I'm just a human and everybody is just a human. But everybody wants to judge someone as better than them. And it's just really interesting because everybody's just people and everyone's just doing their best. And it's for me, it's affected me in the way that then I feel like all this pressure of like, well, now I have to do what everyone else thinks that I'm going to do. I always laugh because I'm like, if people are coming over and I buy something from a store, I can't leave it in the container from the store. Last minute, I'm like, nope, it has to go in a pretty dish and things like that, because I'm like, people have judged me to be, I don't know, better than I feel like I am. So I'm like, well, I have to live up to that. And so I'm like working with my therapist. I'm like, I just want to be mediocre.
No, I hear what you're saying. It's like, it's, again, a lot of it goes into the realm of identity, right? Like, and you sort of like, you think you have your own identity, but then you have the social identity created by expectations of people that you're interacting with, or who are following you, and they're making comments, and that's why this whole social pressure is created, where like, someone posts something, and then these comments, whether it's trolls or positive or negative things. And then that influences people. And then they're like, oh, maybe I should behave like that because that's what's expected of me. And now suddenly you are no longer you. It's almost like someone is hijacking your identity. And now you're supposed to be, like you said, like you're on this pedestal, and now you have to behave certain ways because that's what's expected of you. And that creates a lot of stress and pressure. Yeah,
it's a really weird world that we live in.
So how do we solve that? How do we, like, what do you think,
I want to go be Amish. I don't know.
Just go back to the olden ways. Yeah.
I don't know, because I feel like it's just going to keep rolling. Like we just keep, it's just, it's just the world we live in. It's kind of funny because I collect, like, my house is all done in like vintage and antiques, and so I collect a lot of fun like retro things. And I just picked up this really cute drinking glass, and it had phones on it, and it was like phones from like the 1800s, and you could tell the glass was made in 1964 because that's where it ends. But then there's a picture of one, and it's all the phone of the future, right. And it has a picture, like you're talking like on a picture, and I'm like, they were so right. Like that's where we are, and it just is like technology just keeps growing, and we are just going to keep disconnecting. I mean, my kids text me, I'll be in the other room, and they text me, hey, what's for food? And I'm like, you could just get out of the room, and I would hear you. But we are like really disconnected.
It is. And I think that's in part why some of the treatments, and we'll talk about one of them, is so beneficial in terms of like reframing and getting you back into the feeling of connectedness with everything and everyone, and giving you that perspective. So let's dive into PTSD.
Sounds good.
Yeah. What are your tell me a little bit more about your experience with it, from both personal and other people that you are working with, and what are your thoughts on it, and what have you seen working? Just in general, tell me more about your experience with PTSD.
Okay, so I have very, very mild PTSD from abuse. Like, I really only have like one trigger myself. So mine, like, I don't have any, like, I just don't have anxiety at all, like, in any way. I don't have social anxieties. I don't have, like, I'm weird. So
weird.
Like, I don't know. My family says I'm weird. My daughter's always like, what's it like to be neurotypical? I'm like, it's awesome.
Neurotypical. Okay. So that's a new term for me.
Yeah. Me, like, and I'm not shy, so I'll just say it. Like, if, like, kind of an alpha male type, like, raises his voice or something, I mean, I just start bawling. Like, I freeze up and start bawling, which I'm very, like, assertive, and I don't mind conflict. But if a certain type of, like, man, like, raises, I just start crying. And, like, I've had that issue at the VA before, like, having to, like, deal with stuff for my husband, and there's some jerk employees, and they'll, like, I had one actually yell at me, and I just instantly started bawling, and I just told him, I'm like, can I talk to someone else? Like, you are making me cry. And so that's because of abuse in my life. Like, that's my trigger. Like, if a certain type of man, like, starts yelling at me, I just, like, shrivel up and start crying. Other than that, I have and then we're like, that's what I'm doing EMDR for, like, with my therapist. Like, I'm even trying to work through that, because I'm like, that's, like, dumb. I don't want to just start bawling. Like, I need to be able to deal with that.
So you have to tell me about your experience with EMDR and explain what it is to those who don't know what EMDR is. Like, what is it and how is it? Because there's different kind of forms of it as well. Actually, no, EMDR, I think,
EMDR is the eye movement. I don't know. I kind of feel like it's like voodoo magic. It's so weird. So it's using, like, the left and right side of the brain to desensitize yourself to the traumatic memories. And so sometimes they have light bars. My therapist has, like, a little stick that you follow. And so basically you start with a trauma, like a memory that really, like, bothers you about, whatever it is. It can be combat, it can be abuse. Mm-hmm. For some people it's rape, like, whatever it is. And you don't have to start with the very worst one. Some people don't want to dive right in. Just something that is traumatizing to you. And so you think about that, and you kind of rate it on, like, how much does it bother you when you think about it, and you give it a number rating. And then you're, like, following this little, like, stick thing with your eyes, and then, like, a deep breath, and then you see, like, what pops up in your head. And it's really interesting, like, the thoughts that you have about yourself because of memories. Like, for me, it's interesting, like, I pop around so much about things from the past, things from me raising my kids, things from me now, and it could be anything from, like, I'm a weak person, to I'm a bad mom, to then it's like, no, I'm not a bad mom because I did this, but I should have done and it's just interesting because it's kind of like, so I have fibromyalgia, and so my therapist is working on getting rid of that pain, that because a lot of fibromyalgia is trauma related. of, okay, so with these memories or these thoughts, like, where are you feeling it? So if I feel something like, I'm a bad mom, like, where do you feel it? And it might be like, all of a sudden I have like massive pain in my shoulders. So she'll be like, okay, hold on to that thought, hold on to the pain. And then you go back and do that. And then what comes up next? And I'll be like, well, I know I'm not a bad mom because, I do this. And she'll be like, okay, so, you're saying this, and then you hold on to that and you go through this whole session, and they call them channels, and you go through all the way until it's cleared and find out what is attached. And it's so weird what starts at this original trauma of these things, because then a memory will, and then something like that's happening now will pop up in your brain, and then these random thoughts, and you go all the way until you clear the channel, and then you go back to the original trauma and see how much it affects you, and you're like, nothing. Like, I can think about it and I'm not bothered anymore.
Right.
But you're clearing all of the thoughts that you have about yourself, and and it's weird to figure out that all of those things were attached to this original thing, because you might have been, like, we'll just say if it was like abuse, then you might have been, I'm weak because I took that. And so because I'm weak, that means I wasn't good enough to do this. And then that means this, and that means, and it's affecting you in your life now. And so it's this whole trail of things. And once you clear all of that, like those negative thoughts you have about yourself now are gone. The pain you feel all the time is gone. And you can go back and think about the original trauma without being upset. And it's like taking months or even years worth of therapy in just a few weeks of EMDR.
It's thank you for sharing that, because one of my guests that I had on the show, actually one of probably first guest, Dr. Julie Lopez, she was talking about that, and that's what she uses in her practice. So I was totally ignorant and about that, and she explained it to me, but I wanted to hear it from like someone else who actually has done it, and how that experience was to you. So that's one of the tools that can be used with PTSD and anxiety.
It's very, very effective for PTSD. It's one of the most effective PTSD therapies. Yeah.
It's amazing. What else?
So that's kind of my PTSD. I have a daughter, I mentioned her earlier, who she has severe PTSD from abuse from her dad. And hers is, it's triggered all kinds of other mental issues with her. And so I've basically had to hold her hand through like all of her high school. She's had a lot of suicidal ideation, different medications that we've tried. We had to go through like so many different therapists with her. There was times I'd have to go up to the high school and like walk her from one class to the next, because the anxiety of being in too many people in the hall, because I don't know if you've ever been in a high school hall, but there's screaming and people bouncing balls, and it's just like, some days it was just too much. So I'd go walk her from one class to the next, and then she'd be fine in the class. But she's got pretty severe PTSD. And so I've dealt with that with her. She's done some EMDR. She's in therapy. She sees a psychiatrist regularly. She's on a lot of meds. Like, we're aggressively working with her. She's in college now. She's registered with the disability office. So like her professors now are aware. And we're doing everything we can to help her. She's done a lot of artwork. She's an artist. She was in an art show where all of the artists were victims of domestic violence, and she did that when she painted those when she was 16, and she was the youngest featured artist. And it was just amazing. She painted abuse, and people would just stop and look and just start crying. It was so emotional. And so I've had a lot of abuse or PTSD from abuse experiences with her, helping her through that. I just wanted to make a comment on the art part. It's such a tremendous tool to, I don't know what happens. I've done it as well. And it's like, you're like externalizing something that's inside, and it just kind of let it out through whatever you do, whether it's painting or writing, even like journaling. Some people that, I started journaling, and because you have thoughts in your brain and you think you know what you think, but when you have to write it down, it has to go through this channel, has to be reprocessed into, coherent set of words, and in that it's a process, and that allows you to somehow externalize it, somehow put it out there and process it, and so I can totally relate how useful that is. Yeah, it's been great for her. And when they did the opening for the art show, then they wanted her to speak. And at first she said, okay. And then she was like, it's too much to have people look at my art. And so I actually spoke and I talked about how before she was in therapy, like art was her therapy. So I was like, so there's therapy all over my basement, piles and piles of it. She's like shrinking down in her seat. She's like, you're so embarrassing. But it really was like how she worked through so much of her stuff. And then my husband, of course, has very, very severe combat PTSD. And I met him in 2009. He had been in Iraq in 2003. So I met him several years after his service. And he turned to street drugs to deal with his PTSD. And so the drugs also did some damage as well. So we've got a lot of PTSD. But then he's also, because of drugs and just family history and everything, his PTSD morphed into schizophrenia. So he's got schizophrenia. He's got the PTSD as a lot of moral injury issues. Lot of suicidal ideation. We've been successful in keeping him out of the psych ward for the last few years, but he was in and out a lot. So over like a dozen times, he spent almost a whole year in psych wards at one point. He's done pretty much every therapy you can do, like long-term PTSD treatments, the ones that are like 3 months long. He's done more than one of those inpatient PTSD, all kinds of therapy, all the medications you can think of, everything. So
how is he doing now?
So he just went through the ketamine.
Well, yeah, so let's talk about that.
So this is right now is what we call anniversary season for him. It's his combat anniversary season. So this is the worst time of the year for him, and we're just getting ramped up into it. So it was kind of an interesting time to try ketamine because
when did he do it?
Just this month. This month, yeah. And so his therapist was like, you know what, we're gonna all like work on this together. So she started EMDR with him while during ketamine, like in between sessions, while his mind was open from the ketamine. I went in with him for all of his sessions. So if he was processing during ketamine, I could talk him through it. Like we kind of hit him from every angle. Right. We talked to his psychiatrist before he went because of the schizophrenia. There's a little bit of different issues. We talked to the doctor at the clinic too. And we're like, and he's like, you know, there's some risks, but if a psychiatrist says okay. So this was a little bit of a different situation for ketamine for someone that has active psychosis because it is a psychedelia. You know, who knows what will happen.
That can trigger some kind of unexpected reaction.
Yes.
So I really love what you did, and actually even talking to my wife, and who's a mental health counselor, and she said, like, you know, how great would it be when you combine the treatments where you have the talk therapy, when you have kind of like the guidance of a counselor who already knows your history and knows that, and take you through it as you're going through this treatment with ketamine.
Yeah. And so that's kind of what we did, was all of it. Like we hit it from all the angles. So he would go into EMDR, and then sometimes like later that day go in for a session. Then I would be in there, and because I mean during the sessions he might be talking about things from childhood or from the war, and so I could talk him through that. Especially if he was, you know, one time things came out and he's like, the war wasn't my fault. Like he said that while he was on ketamine, and I was able to like talk to him about that. And I mean, you've done ketamine, so you know you're not quite all there, but he's processing things. And so I was like, yeah, you're right. Like it wasn't your fault. And so, you know, talking to him about that and letting him like kind of talk it out as he's actually under the ketamine. And it was a really interesting experience with him. During the 2.5 weeks he was going through all the treatments, he was really happy, which was weird because he's always like super negative. Right. But even like going through everything, like he was really like happy and bouncy, and but the ketamine sessions themselves started getting like really hard on him. Like the higher up the dose, they were getting a lot harder on him, like emotionally, mentally, physically. Like he was physically ill, didn't matter how many like meds they gave him for nausea, like he was still sick. Right. So he started being like, I don't know if I want to finish. I'm like, oh, you're finishing. But we went through all of them, and it's really interesting because it didn't like magically clear up his depression. Like I've heard, like a lot of vets are like, it's like night and day.
Right.
But he had other issues too. But he's had so much focus. And for him, like with someone with schizophrenia, you don't have any focus. Like he cannot focus ever on anything. And he's got all of this focus, which is amazing. Like we helped a friend move in and he put together her furniture for her. And she looked at me and she's like, what is this? I'm like, ketamine. Like this is what this is. And he's able to read the instructions and put the stuff together. And this is before like his schizophrenia symptoms came. Like that's who he used to be. He used to come over and like we were best friends for 5 years before we got married. He used to come help me if something would break. He would come help me, and he started like doing stuff like that again around the house. And he's like started listening to audiobooks, which he has not been able to do that for a long time because his voices just pipe in and he can't. And, but I think he's on his third audio book just in the last 2 weeks.
Amazing. So what do you think is happening, like from your perspective in like the treatment? Is it like, my understanding is that ketamine allows you to, and this is what Dr. Himshaw was saying when he was a guest on the podcast over here, he said it allows you to like rewire some of your brain. Like it opens up, it gives you different perspectives. The parts of the brain that are normally not talking can be talking, and then rewiring some of that and kind of recontextualizing things. So from my layman's perspective and from my experience, that's kind of what I feel is happening. But like, what is it from like your experience?
Right. And that's what I've heard too, because I did a ton of research before I was going to send him in there. I didn't want to do more damage. And that's what I've heard too, is like it actually like fixes broken neurons and things like that. And so obviously something has happened.
Right.
It's interesting. He cannot tell a difference, but that's him with his mental illness. He can never tell. He's like, it's just me. Right. But he's got a lot more focus. He's got a lot more motivation. His therapist is like when he comes in, she's like, he looks me in the eye now. Like he's able to, like, when we're talking, he can keep on track instead of constantly being distracted. And if he gets distracted, we can bring him right back on. So it's interesting because like the suicidal thoughts really haven't calmed down a ton, but he's focused enough that we can like talk about it instead of him spiraling into it. And so it's really interesting because we've had a totally different experience, but his anxiety has calmed down some, where it's easier for him to talk himself into doing things. Like it used to be for him to even go outside to our front porch. It would take 30 minutes for him to even get himself out onto the porch. And now it's just kind of like, okay, like this is making me nervous, but I can do it. And he just goes. So the anxiety's still there, but he can push through it. And it's like he's able to kind of feel his feelings again. So the depression's still there because there's things he's sad about. It's anniversary season, things like that. He's thinking about Iraq because it's that time of year. But it's not just this constant state of depression. So he can be sad about it, but he's also feeling like happy feelings too, where he didn't feel those for a long time. So it's kind of like he can feel both now. So it's been really interesting. I noticed a huge change. It's just so weird that he can't notice a change.
It's the more I'm kind of delving into this and talking to a lot of different guests from different disciplines, like doctors, like a medical doctor, but then also psychologists and like Dr. Himstra and with ketamine, like I really am seeing the patterns of how things are connected as a system. Like you that's why like I applaud what you did with having that treatment along with the psychologist supporting with everything. So it's like from different angles, like you said yourself, you're kind of attacking it from different angles because that's what it is. It's a system of things. So like it's like that old adage about five people touching different part of the elephant, and everyone is describing something else, but it's part of that one thing. And I think in general that's a healthy approach of kind of attacking a problem or a situation from different angles and having different perspectives.
Yeah, it's funny because like everybody is noticing a difference. He went in, he go on once a month for an injection at the VA, and the nurse who gave it was like you're looking me in the eye and smiling. He's like, I don't think you've done that in the last year. And so it's just like little differences.
Yeah.
Like it's not this huge like night and day like a lot of people have noticed, where they're like, oh, my depression and suicidal ideation's gone. That's definitely not him. He's still thinking about it.
Right.
But we're noticing positive changes, which is amazing. And so that's all we wanted.
And it's a process too, right? It's you know, like I said, I always say like this, it's not a magical pill. There's no magical pill that will just take, because we're super complex beings, super complex systems. It's not like you just like pop this in and boom, everything is done. But it opens up, and if you work with what the opening that's given to you, then you have a chance of rewiring yourself, changing yourself, having that introspection of like seeing some of the things about yourself that you would normally not even be able to see. But you know, you couple that with different types of therapies and talking that out, again, external processing it, externalizing it, and then it's a process, and you just keep on going with that, and hopefully that's what's going to continue to help him out.
Yeah, and with him, you know, he just doesn't. I think he doesn't really have the ability to see the difference within himself, just because of how far his illnesses have progressed, but everybody else is seeing the difference. So that's what we want. We want him to have a happier life and to be able to do more things. And I think he's realizing he can do more things, even though he's like, I feel like I was always doing them. Right. But he doesn't know. That is funny.
That is funny that he is like, oh, what are you talking about? I've been always like this. I'm
like, you haven't read a book for years, but here you are. This is like your third one in the last 2 weeks. But in his mind, he's like, what are you talking about? I always read books. Yeah. He doesn't, so he can't really comprehend, but all of us are noticing the difference. And so it's giving him a better quality of life, which is fabulous. Like that's really what I want for him, is, you know, it's having a better relationship for us when he's able to look me in the eye more often. And so while he's doing better, like his therapist suggested that he read a book on like relationships with people and like trying to understand other people. And so he's listening to this book and he's like, did you know? And like things are, I'm like, I did know. but he's trying to understand. And so we're all trying to use this, you know, while his mind's open and while he's comprehending things a little bit better. And so, it's great to see these differences in him. It was interesting though. He was feeling suicidal, like a week or so ago. And it was the one time that he actually mentioned that he noticed a difference, because he said, he's like, I keep thinking about suicide. And I think it's because his voices were telling him schizophrenia is an awful disease and the voices are horrible. And they were telling him to kill himself. And he's like, I worry about it more now. He's like, because I have more focus. I worry that I might actually do it. And I was like, okay, he does notice a difference because he's noticing that he is more focused now. He's all, I have focus and motivation. So he's like, I might follow through. And so, you know, I just did the whole, you know, making sure he was safe and talking through and all of that. But he did notice that his brain was working differently. Right.
I was going to ask you about schizophrenia and that experience, because that must be a wild ride. And so how do you wow, like where do you even start? Like, how do you deal with it? How do you help someone? And how do you even understand what they're going through?
It's crazy. It's literally crazy. Yeah. So I married him knowing I would be his full-time caregiver. Like I said, like we were best friends for 5 years, and I saw his illness like progress. Like I knew him before he had voices in his head. And by the time we got married, he had both the visual and auditory hallucinations. And so I knew like this was going to be a full-time thing, taking care of him. And to especially have schizophrenia combined with combat PTSD, it's really intense. And so we have times a year, like especially during like this combat anniversary season, it's really, really intense, because most of his hallucinations are focused around the war. And so there's things like he will think that we're under attack, or when he goes into a flashback, it's more than a flashback. Like he might actually be like reliving it for like 30 minutes to an hour, where he's actually back there and he's like going through the motions. Everybody's like, it's all happening, which can be traumatic for me, like I actually started counseling at the vet center really soon after we got married because I knew I was a high risk for secondary PTSD. I'm like, I am reliving his war experiences with him on a regular basis. So we got married in December and his anniversary season starts in January. So we were going right into the crazy. And it's pretty intense. Like we go through times where I feel like I don't quite have a husband because he's just so like wrapped up in his own mind and what's going on. He's got
what do you do to to deal with that?
So many things. So I'm a big believer in self-care. Like that's my big platform is self-care for caregivers.
So what do you do?
So I get massages every single month. I attend there's like events and things for caregivers, like Hearts of Valor is one. Here in Utah, we have monthly caregiver get-togethers, so I do those with other caregivers.
Is that part of the Battlin Betties?
Nope, it's part of Operation Homefront. Okay. They have just a group of caregivers that get together once a month in different states, and we have an active one here in Utah. I attend a weekly support group at the vet center that they have for spouses. I go to my own therapy every single week to just kind of deal with everything I deal with. Volunteering is huge for me. Like it's a way that it's a lot of work, but it's a way for me to interact with people and get out and do good and get out of my own home and
purpose,
my own situation. And
purpose-filled.
It is. I'm a big fan of service and I can bring my husband with me a lot of the times. If it's unsafe to leave him at home, he gets to come with me. So we always tease him that he's kind of like our mascot of the Utah Battlin Betties. He's just like, why? But they all love him. He's like the biggest teddy bear. Like everyone who meets him just like loves him and wants to hug him and take care of him. He's like the sweetest. He has like the sweetest spirit. It's like really funny. He's not one of those PTSD vets that's like all rough and tumble. He's like so sweet and everyone just wants to like love on him.
Right.
So but I definitely I do a lot of self-care things like to make
you got to take care of yourself to take care of others.
Yeah, or I would be no good for him or anyone else. So
So in addition to Battlin Betties, you also are involved in Elizabeth Dole Foundation. Can you tell me more about that and how does that fold into your life?
Yeah. So the Elizabeth Dole Foundation is huge. It's based out of Washington, D.C., and that is the big foundation for caregivers. So there's actually 5.5 million military and veteran caregivers in the country. And so the foundation, they are the ones that advocate for caregivers. They're the ones that are involved with creating legislation for caregivers, creating programs through the VA for caregivers, everything, anything to do with caregivers, that is their mission. And they have in every single state, they have a Dole Fellow that serves a 2-year term. And that Dole Fellow is representing the caregivers in their state, advocating for the caregivers in their state. They have resources for them, all of that. So that's me right now. I'm serving my 2-year term.
Okay. And how does that work on from like a operational perspective? Like, what do you do as the Dole Fellow? Do you interact with the local politicians over here, some other groups to kind of spearhead whatever programs you're working on? How does it work in your capacity work role?
So it's kind of awesome. Like they let each Dole Fellow operate like how they want to, like what fits in best for their talents and their situations. And so for me, like I was already super involved in our community. Obviously, like I was already doing an organization and really involved. And so, we can kind of do whatever we want. Like if we want to be involved with the political level, we can. If it's just about sharing our story, then we can do that too, which like I've written an article in our local Valor magazine sharing my story. I've written an article for Times Online, I don't know what you call it, online magazine, I guess. But different things. I'm all about sharing my story and our experiences. But I do attend like the local Veterans Council meetings. We have them in different counties. So I attend those and make sure I know what's going on with our caregivers and our vets in our area. We go through a lot of trainings with the Dole Foundation. There's always like online trainings where we keep up on everything that's going on with caregivers on a national level, different organizations nationally, and so we can bring that back to our communities. There's just all kinds of things. And once a year we go back to DC for a huge week-long training and a big thing where it's a huge week. We go meet with our senators and representatives in DC and talk to them about the issues. And
right.
But yeah, I actually do know all of the staffers for everyone here in Utah, and we've been talking about doing a big meetup soon, getting together with like all of them and talking about caregivers here in our state and what we can do better.
So what do you see that's done well? What do you see that works? And what do you see some areas of improvement? What's not done as well in terms of supporting veterans as a nationally or even locally, areas of improvement, and what's done well and what can still have some improvement to it?
So I think locally, one of the biggest things is reaching caregivers, and that's probably not just a local thing, but across the nation, is helping caregivers to self-identify. Like most of them will be like, oh, I'm just their wife. Like I just do this because that's what a wife does. And here they are like managing medications and driving to the VA and helping with like all these things. And they don't realize like, yes, you are a wife, but that's going above and beyond. Like you are a caregiver. Yeah. And so helping people to self-identify so that they realize that they need support. And so that's a big thing is reaching out. And it's interesting because like once you meet someone and you talk to them and they realize they are a caregiver, they usually just break down and just because they've been carrying all of that all by themselves thinking, why is my marriage so hard? Like, why am I doing this all by myself with no support? And then they realize there's a lot of support. And I meet a lot of caregivers. They're like, oh, I'm thinking about starting a nonprofit for caregivers. And then you talk to them and you let them know there's a million nonprofits for caregivers. They just don't know. They don't know how to find the resources and how to connect with other caregivers. So
it seems like a lot of it is just building awareness and spreading the message. And what kind of support do they typically get from the organizations that you are involved in? If someone self-identifies as caregiver and approaches, what kind of support do you guys can offer to them or do offer them?
The biggest thing is meeting up with other caregivers. So like the Vet Center has weekly meetups for spouses of veterans that are Vet Center eligible. Some organizations like Wounded Warrior Project Hearts of Valor, you have to be post 9/11, which is hard because there's a lot of caregivers who are pre 9/11. The VA themselves, they have a caregiver program where if you're more like a full-time caregiver, you can actually be paid to be a caregiver. Like if you're doing that as a full-time. That was post 9/11, but with the Mission Act that went through just recently, that's being expanded to all eras. So there's several different things that can be done. Battlin Betties is actually, we're getting ready to launch, hopefully within this next year, a new caregiver program that I actually created. So I'm doing that on a national level. But so one thing that we've done in the past here in Utah that I just took on because I started to see that it was a big need is caregiver retreats. And that's something that everyone applies for. They have them all different organizations have them, and you apply and you hope you get in. And if you do, like you go to a different state and it's super cool and you meet ladies, but then you come back home and all you got really was a weekend away and maybe a couple resources. But what's really needed is that long-term friendship with other people who understand. And so I've hosted a couple of caregiver retreats locally where I just rented an Airbnb. I just had everyone pitch in like their $20 a person. We assigned people meals and we all just got together and cooked. And there wasn't any big agenda. There wasn't anything like one time we had someone come in and teach us yoga. One time we had someone come in and teach us how to make homemade pasta. I mean, it was just fun stuff. There was no therapy. There was no one lecturing us on self-care. Like we know we need self-care, but so many women have a hard time like finding the time for it or, whatever it is. And it's like, how many times are you going to lecture us? Like we came here for self-care. Don't tell us we need self-care while we're at our self-care. And so I did these retreats and these women would come. And it was awesome to get away. Some of them, it was the first time they had ever left their veteran home. But what was amazing was the friendships that were built afterwards. And then they would go back home and keep in contact. And then they would get together and their kids would play together. And then eventually they would do double dates and their husbands would make friends. These veterans who are like 100% rated for PTSD and never want to leave their house are getting out, and people would do like family potlucks. And I'm like, okay, so the retreats were great, but the after was what was awesome. So I've gone through and I've created this whole program of how we can duplicate this on a national level. Of very simply, it's not about getting flown to some cool location. It's not about a fancy hotel, because I've stayed in some fancy hotels on retreats. It's not about going out to a restaurant every meal. It's just about getting together in a home with other ladies, cooking together, which I think is bonding.
It is. Yeah.
And just hanging out and chatting. And if the conversation goes towards PTSD or caregiving, great. But if it never does, that's okay too, because it's about getting away and building those friendships in your own geographical location. And so not having people from another state come to yours, but learning how to do it in your own area. Because when I was doing these, all these people are like, I wish we had that in our area. I wish we had it. I'm like, you can't. I just did this myself. I went on Airbnb and found a house that fit 16 people. It wasn't a big deal. And so I've got this all worked out of how, we can get like corporate sponsors to actually cover the cost of this. And then we can go train people who would be willing to head these up and get their ladies. But really, it's all about getting them together for the weekend, because you can really bond over the 3 days, and then the friendships that happen afterwards.
I love it. I think it's so obvious in a way, right? Because it's like you're building a community, micro community, local to you. So you don't have to be, because the biggest thing that often people think is like, well, how much is it going to cost? I have to go somewhere and all that. And you can do it on a dime, right? You can do it local. You can do it effectively and quickly. And it's about building that fabric, that community that understands and support and get away. So these caregivers can recharge their batteries and then go back in and battle and have that support network, so they know they're not alone.
Yes, and like these Airbnbs I was running, they're like $700 for a weekend, for someone to come in and like sponsor this for care. I'm like, it's like nothing. Where I've gone to these retreats and they put each of us in our own fancy room, and then I get in my room and I'm like, it's like lonely. I want to be chatting with the other ladies. And that's the whole point, right? Of getting together. And when I do our own retreats, like we may be sharing a bed with someone we never met before, and that's fun. Like we're doing our makeup in the same mirrors, and everyone's chatting. And we're women. We don't mind sharing space. We all have kids. That it's not a big deal. And so it's really, really fun to do these this way. Very inexpensive. I mean, you could do the whole retreat for well under $2,000 versus these other ones that, they're expensive. And that's why it's so hard to get into, because they can only put them on once a year and you have to fly people out, and it's airfare. And this is such a nice local way. And it would be such a great way for community, like businesses, to be able to give back. And my biggest thing is, if you want to take care of a veteran, you take care of the people taking care of the veteran. Yeah. A lot of veterans, they don't want the thank you. They're like, don't tell me thank you. You don't even know what I did over there. That you get the whole spiel from them. They don't want the swag. They get all the gifts and the swag and all of that. And a lot of them, they don't want it. But if you take care of their spouse, that makes the veteran happy. And that veteran's going to be a lot more taken care of, relaxed, when his caregiver is taken care of and relaxed. Yeah. And they are the ones that really appreciate the thank yous and the relaxation and the getting away for a weekend. And I mean, veterans, I love veterans, and obviously I do things for veterans too, but I've learned that the ones that really, really appreciate it are the caregivers taking care of those veterans. They are so worn out, and they are so in need of that companionship with other caregivers and just that little getaway. And it's yeah, I mean, I see like the thread of, both threads of like, it's not... the issue might be at a point with someone who's affected, but it's the network and people around that person that are affected as well. Yep. And so if you want to help that individual, you need to help the support network as well. And it just kind of feeds on itself. Yep. It's a whole system. So you have to address that. So, and someone actually was mentioning this to me. I think it was actually Nate Brooks
husband, he said, like, like suicide is not only affecting obviously the person who's trying to commit it, but also everybody around you,
Yes.
like the whole family and everybody else. So it's like, it's in a way, it would be like selfish to just think that it just affects one person. No, it doesn't. It affects everybody around. And so it's the same thing.
I've seen that. I actually have friends who have lost either a son or a spouse, in the military world to suicide. And you see everyone sees it at first, the funeral, but when you see it later on, I mean, I had one friend and she would post on Facebook, and her husband would always do you'd be better off without me, you'd be better off without me. Well, and then she lost him and, and here she was, losing her house and not able to pay her bills and having to deal with her kids. And he was like, you think like this is better than your PTSD and having to deal with your depression and all. And I mean, it's just, you don't see a lot of the times like what's happening much later on.
It's a domino effect in a way. It's a one thing, everything is connected. Like we talked about that. Everything is connected. And so like if you think that something just happens in a vacuum, no, it doesn't. Like everything is going to affect other things. And so it's important to kind of have that perspective and also remember that take care of other people who are taking care of those in need.
Yeah, it's very important. And like I saw a study on the cost of like the caregivers for the caregiver program, and the VA put this out, and it was showing that they paid the caregivers, but also the cost for each veteran went way up when you pay their caregiver, because if you have a caregiver, the veterans are going in for their appointments, they're getting their medication, they're seeing their specialists. And so one person was trying to be like, I don't understand why we're paying caregivers because this is costing us way too much money. They're like, the veterans are getting the care they need because someone's taking care of them.
Right.
When they don't have a caregiver, they're not getting care. And that's just the thing. When you have someone taking care of a veteran, all of a sudden they're getting into all their appointments. They're taking their medication. They're having someone advocate for them to go beyond just a primary care. And they're getting into specialists. And my friends, like all these people I know, we have to fight sometimes to get into specialized care or to get treatments covered or different things. And a veteran, a lot of times, they're either just going to say it's not worth it, or they're going to get angry, they're going to hang up the phone. And then you've got these caregivers all over the nation. I know caregivers in every state that are fighting so hard to get their veterans the care that they need. I mean, these caregivers they're worn out. They are fighting a fight that the veterans a lot of them have TBIs. They've got severe PTSD. They just don't have it in them to fight these fights. So they just don't get the care. But the caregivers are doing it. They've got piles of paperwork and they're documenting things and they're going for, like, I've had to go above people's heads before and get things taken care of. And the veterans that have different issues, they're not able to. It's a government system. It's a nightmare for anyone to deal with. And if you have someone with PTSD and a TBI and these different, it's impossible for them to navigate. So you've got caregivers, just whether they're paid caregivers or not paid caregivers, they're navigating this system and they're taking care of their veterans.
Well, I'm sure there's a lot of bureaucracy around that, and that leads me to a question of like what can be done better? What are some of the areas of improvements that you see that could be done? After having several years of experience with this, and so you've seen the system, you've seen you've seen what can be done by just organizing something yourselves, but you also see like what you can tap in from the government and from those resources, and then what else can be done? What else can be improved on? What do you think?
I think awareness is a huge thing, and that's something like just recently the campaign for inclusive care just went through, which is incredible, where they're actually training the VA doctors and nurses and staff of like what a caregiver is and that they need to be included in with the veteran, that they are actually part of the veteran's care team, just like the doctor or the nurse. And so they're not just a wife that's there.
Right.
I've had pretty good experiences with them just including me. I think just because that's just me, I go in and I'm like, this is this and this is this, but a lot of people haven't, and they've been asked to stay out in the lobby, or they'll try to make a phone call and they're like, we need to talk to the veteran, even though the veteran has no idea. And And so they're now training the VA staff that, no, like a caregiver is part of the team. Like they know usually more of what's going on with the veteran than the veteran themselves. They'll tell you like what's happening. And so there's a whole training that's going on in the VA right now that's actually teaching them. And so it's that awareness like within the hospitals, the clinics, but also within the public of what a caregiver is. I went to a caregiver retreat earlier this year, and they had someone from the Red Cross come in. And so every person in there they were all caregivers of veterans. And the person from the Red Cross came in to teach us, I don't know, some like weird breathing thing. The first thing she said, she's like, oh, so you guys are all married to veterans, right? Well, tell all your spouses thank you for their service. And we all are just like, wrong thing to say to a group of caregivers. Like we're in here supposed to be, getting all empowered about like how awesome like our service is, and someone from the Red Cross comes in and tells us all to tell our husbands thank you for their service. And we're like, and so it's that like awareness of people need to know that yes, I really appreciate what my husband did. He did incredible things during his service, and I'm so proud of him. But also, like, when I meet a caregiver, I make sure that I tell them thank you. Yeah. Like, I was at a Veterans Day event in West Valley City, and I was chatting. There was a group of older ladies that came in, and so I went up and started talking to them, and they were all widows. They'd all lost their husband over the last year, each of them. Just apparently they all lost them just a few weeks apart, and they had all been Vietnam vets, and were telling me they had all cared for them. And so I was just like, I told them, I was like, I know how hard it is to be a caregiver. So thank you for your service and everything that you did for and all of them just teared up, and they all gave me hugs. And I don't know if anyone's ever told them thank you for their service of what they gave to their country of taking care of these veterans until the day they died. And then here they were on Veterans Day to honor their husbands' memories. And people just don't think to do that, to thank someone for taking care of a veteran.
Right. You mentioned to me a documentary that about PTSD and I guess veterans. I was just curious if that documentary reflected a little bit of that, like, or made that awareness about the caregivers, or was it just so strictly on the veterans that that the whole caregiving network, it was neglected.
The documentary that my husband was in. Yeah. So it was on the mental health care crisis in the military. So it was just on the veterans. And I gave the filmmakers a hard time a couple times. I'm like, what about the caregivers? And they're like, well, we interviewed one wife because she was an ex-wife, because she gave her experience what it was like to be married to someone with PTSD. Mm-hmm. I'm like, I'm not talking about the ex-wives. Right? A lot of veterans have ex-wives. I'm like, I'm talking about the people day to day taking care of veterans. And I'm like, that is what the story that needs to be told. And they're like, no, we haven't thought of that. I'm like, but that's it really is important of getting the awareness out there. Just people don't think about that.
Yeah, no, I think it's important to give it broader context, and so even through like podcasts like this one where we just talk about it, and hopefully people will get that information and get that perspective that, hey, it's about veterans, it's about affected people, but it's also about that social network, and how do we support that, and what can be done to support people that are supporting.
Right. Like my husband, before we were married, like during the time we were best friends before we were married, he was homeless. He was on street drugs. He was in and out of the psych ward like all the time. Like, one of the things I'm like, if we get married, if I'm taking, like, you're off everything. He has not touched a single drug, alcohol, cigarettes, anything in over 5 years. He's had one psych ward visit pretty soon after we got married, and we've been able to keep him out of the psych ward. Like, and he knows, like, when they do our caregiver visits, because I'm on the caregiver program, they'll do these in-home visits, and they always ask him, they're like, where would you be without your wife? And he's like, homeless or dead. And he knows it because that was his life before. Like, he lost his house. He wasn't able to keep up on his bills. He lost visitation to his kids. He lost his job. He had been working full time after the military at Hill Air Force Base. He lost his job because of his PTSD. He just couldn't manage his life. And eventually he just went and lived in the mountains because it was easier than dealing with people. And there's so many stories just like that. Without a caregiver, these veterans, they would be homeless. They would be on drugs. They wouldn't be taking their medication. They wouldn't be at appointments. It really is the family members. And it's not just spouses. I know a lot of caregivers that are parents, that are siblings, that are, a best friend, just people stepping in and caring for a veteran, that they're keeping these veterans alive.
Speaking of drugs and street drugs and everything, one of the things that was really curious to me when I started engaging with the ketamine clinic and learning more about what they're doing through the treatment and all of that is a sort of like weird and funny perception about like the treatment itself. Like, yes. It's it's some kind of tranquilizer, people getting high and all of that. It's almost like a stigma of this that kind of followed this treatment, as if people would just want to go over there and get high on this thing.
Right.
So my question to you is, given that your husband went through that treatment and given that his history of using street drugs and being in that space, weren't you worried that maybe might trigger like either some kind of addiction to this, or like, or were those founded or unfounded worries? Like, what was your experience with that?
So during the initial consultation, they actually asked him, because one of the things is like, have you ever used drugs?
Right.
And they asked him if he'd ever used psychedelics before, and he had. And they're like, we're actually glad you've used psychedelics, because you're more prepared than someone who's never used psychedelics. Because someone who's never used. I had a friend, she's a veteran too, who went through the ketamine treatments in December, and she's like, I've never even been drunk. So it was like totally new experience for him. He's like been through like every drug possible and had been through psychedelics. So, and his first treatment actually to him was amazing. It was like a psychedelic high. He's like, this is the best thing we've ever done. I can't believe you brought me to this. And then after that, they just were getting more intense. He's like, never mind, this isn't fun. This is medicine.
Right.
But no, like ketamine is actually used for drug addiction. Like I've talked to people who have had drug addictions and use ketamine to get off of it. So I wasn't worried at all. It was like, nope. But it was funny. The first session, it was an awesome trip for him, and he thought it was the greatest thing ever.
Right.
Then after that, they kept getting harder and harder, and he's like, "Those aren't very fun anymore."
Yeah, so. it is a mind-opening experience, which people think like, oh, it's just like some kind of, you're gonna get like colors and whatever, like some kind of geometrical shapes or whatever. But it is just like so harder on your brain to process what's happening and take all that in, that it is not a recreational thing that people would do. And in fact, I believe that Dr. Himshah was saying that can be used in actually breaking addiction to alcohol and,
all the time.
And drugs.
Yeah, it's used all the time.
So it's a But I wanted to hear somebody else's perspective and experience. Someone who, like your husband had.
Yeah, I mean, ketamine is a street drug. People use it on the street.
Right.
It's so, people do hear ketamine and they're like I know one veteran who gets drug tested regularly, and he asked me, he's like, would they write me a note so that when I'm like, of course they would. It's a doctor. They'll write you a note and say like this ketamine, because ketamine is a street drug and it's used as a street drug. Right. It's not used in a street drug in the method they use it in the clinic. That's a totally different. Right. I mean, they use ketamine in hospitals. They use it in emergency rooms.
Let's be clear. This is fully legal.
Yes, but it is a street drug. I've had friends that have gotten high off of ketamine.
Right.
But it's definitely the way they use it. No, it's used to combat addiction, and I've known people that have had like addiction and gotten off of it because of ketamine. So and my husband, he's been clean off of drugs, for 5-6 years, but still talks about them like almost every day of, I wish I had some meth. And I'm like, it's one of those things where even though he hasn't had it, you can tell he was addicted. But since he's been on ketamine, he really hasn't mentioned it. He doesn't bring it up like he used to every single day. So, and that's what I was hoping. I was like, even though hadn't been a user for all those years, I was hoping it would kind of clear up that part of his brain that still wanted them.
Right.
And he really hasn't talked about drugs since he's gone through ketamine. So I haven't mentioned it to him because I don't want to like re-trigger that where he's like, oh yeah, meth.
Right.
So I haven't said a word to him about it. Yeah. But he hasn't mentioned it. Like he used to bring it up every single day. It's like whenever he'd be tired, he'd be like, oh, if I had some meth, I wouldn't be tired. I'm like, well, that's true. But then you've got all the other, bad things to do with it. So I do think it kind of helped that part of his brain as well. Yeah,
I believe that it does help rewire your brain in its setting, as they say, what you're going to feed your brain post the treatment as well.
Yes.
And I was talking to Dr. Himstra about it, is that, I understand now why you're doing this protocol in multiple days over a period of time, so your brain can process this. And then, there's a support network in which that will help you literally reshape where you want to be, and it will give you that opening, but it's going to be your job to walk through that, through that gate. But if you have that support network around you, and whether it's like your, caregiver or some kind of psychologist or counselor, whoever, to help you with that, your chances are so much higher to reclaim your life.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that's just the same with anything. I mean, they say any sort of recovery, no matter what it is, you need a support team.
Yeah.
Like you need a team around you. Like your recovery they've shown for cancer, people who have a support team, you're a lot more likely to recover if you've got friends and family around you versus doing it by yourself. Yeah. Depression, any physical ailments, whatever it is, if you've got a great support team, you're more likely to recover.
Yeah, no, I totally believe that. And it's, so what is next for you? What's you've done so much work in this domain, and what is left to be done other than continuing with your mission to spread the awareness of what you're doing? What else can be done?
Oh my goodness. It feels like it's never ending work. So there's always things to be done. We're working really hard on growing our Utah Battlin Betties platoon. We are so in demand. It's insane. Like, we have a lot of times where we're double booked and we're turning down other events that people want us at. So we're just working on growing our platoon to be big enough to meet the demand. So that's a big thing, is just trying to get all the people that we can involved in what we're doing. It's just, it's such a great thing, not only for the veterans, but the women involved. I see like self-esteem blossom, and they feel really empowered that they're doing good work. But also, I think a lot of it is the dress too, dressing from the era, getting the compliments and feeling pretty. We get a lot of women who join our platoon after they've left the military because they still want to give back in the military community, but they lived in a man's world for so long. They're like, I can't even remember the last time I wore makeup. I don't even own a dress. And so I get a lot of those, like when I do their interview with them, that they're like, I want to feel like a girl again, but still give back in the military world. So we get a lot of that. And so it's empowering for the women involved, but also, we're doing a lot of good. And so growing our platoon is really big, because I feel bad when I have to turn down good causes, and it makes me feel sad. And I'm like, I wish we could, but we're already double booked. There's times we've been triple booked sometimes. And so there's only this much time in a day that you can do what you can do. So maybe growing your ranks is what you need in order to kind of be able to scale this up. Yeah, so that's a big thing. And then for me personally, it's really balancing the self-care along with all of that, because I am involved in like so many different organizations and helping out so many different things, that is just making sure that I keep that time with my husband, and that is top priority, and just keeping up on my self-care. Like, my therapist will tease me because like I love speaking, and like one of my favorite speaking topics is self-care. And so she's always like, remember, like, you can't just teach about it, like you've got to do it, because sometimes I'll get really overwhelmed, and then I'm like, ah! And I realize I haven't been doing all the things that I need to do. And so making sure that like I keep that balance of my husband and his care really comes, and then my care too, like that comes first, and then the other stuff fills in. Yeah. If you were to give top 3 things to a person who is a caregiver and doesn't know it yet, maybe, what would those be? And sort of like, obviously you can't package that into like 3 seconds, but kind of like the top things, and then what should I do next? So caregivers, I think the most important thing is to seek out other caregivers. Like, that's the most important thing. Like, so connect. It's important to have, for me especially, to have friends in the civilian world as well. I don't like to lose touch with that. Sometimes people will do that and they only want to be around people. And I think that can be a lonely world too, to only And I just think it's a boring world to only hang around people that are exactly like you. So not lose touch with the civilian world, but also to really seek out other caregivers, I think is number one, because you feel validated. You don't feel so isolated. Like you realize what you're going through. It may not be normal, but it's common for people in your situation. Right. So that's definitely number one. Self-care, of course, is huge. And self-care does not mean things like bubble baths and getting your nails done. It's you making sure that your physical health is taken care of. So I know. I have people like, I take a bath every single night and I'm still stressed out. I'm like, because that's just taking a bath. Yeah. But making sure that, you're getting into your appointments and your like physical health, your mental health, that you're connecting with other humans, that you're doing all those things that you need to do kind of on the physical, mental, spiritual, like all of those levels, like you need all of that.
All the needs.
Yeah. And if you're not doing that, you can go get your nails done once a week and you're not going to feel any better. Right. So self-care is such like a buzzword now that, eat the chocolate and drink the wine. And that's not self-care. Like you need to take care of yourself as a human and the other stuff. Yeah, that can be fun, but it's not true self-care. So, right. Yeah. So those are the really big ones. And then a huge one for caregivers is making sure that what you're going through is appropriate behavior, that, it is PTSD or depression and not abuse, because a lot of caregivers will take a lot of things in the name of, well, he's a veteran and, I'm caring for him, but they're actually being abused, whether it's verbal, physical, emotional, whatever it is. And so to really check yourself. And sometimes that takes hanging around with other caregivers, or it could be going into a therapist or reading a book or whatever it is. But a lot of caregivers are in an abusive situation without realizing it. They'll think that, well, that's just PTSD, because what they know from PTSD is what they see on movies of, well, he screams and he drinks a lot and he hits me. But all of the movies, they do that when they get back from war. So that's PTSD. And that is nothing to do with PTSD at all. That is not PTSD. That's abuse. And so, check yourself, because you might be in a really bad situation that has nothing to do with PTSD. You might just be in an abusive situation.
Right,
so, yeah.
Right.
So I would say those are my top three.
Okay. And if someone would give you a magic wand that you could do something, create something and help in the world of mental health, which I believe now it's kind of living a renaissance in a way where it's being talked more about. It's you have, eat good food, take care of your body, go to the gym, do all those things, but also now take care of your mind.
Yeah.
What do you think would be the biggest thing if you could magically swing that magic wand and fix things to help people take care of themselves and their mental health? What would that look like? What would that be?
Oh man, that's a hard question. I honestly think that human connection is the biggest thing that we need to fix. I really do.
Yeah.
I think that you can eat all the foods and go on all the crazy gluten-free diets, and you can, go to the gym and you can do all of those things. But until we have like real human connections with each other, I don't think any of the rest is going to matter.
And that's in part also where you get, I think, an opening too. When you go through that ketamine treatment and when you talk to other people, you see that opening, that it's that connection that will make you hang on, that will make you want to change yourself, because if you're going to be in a vacuum, you won't.
Yeah.
But when you connect and you have that support network, that's the chances are on your side.
Yeah. Well, mental illness is, it really, and I don't know, maybe this is a bad thing to say, but it's kind of a selfish illness. It really is. People who suffer from mental illness, it's kind of like the world revolves around them. And not because they want it to be that way, but it's hard for them to dig out of that. It's hard for them to see beyond what they're dealing with and what they're suffering with. It's hard for them to be giving. Like they might seem flaky because they miss a lot of things. They might not remember other people's birthdays because they're just so, they're going to be late a lot. There's just, and I hate to generalize things, but there's a lot of things that come with mental illness. Like it's kind of all about them a lot of times. And it really just is a selfish illness. And so when you can open that up where you can start to see outside of yourself and see other people, then you can get more of those connections.
Right. Do you think that a lot of victim, because like it feels like we're kind of propelling, or what seems like a lot is what's happening is there's this propensity to propel the victims. Gosh, what do you want to call it? Victim status or victim, like I'm a victim of this, right. and you then people get into the role of that, and that's what they find like they identify with that. Like this is what I am now, and I'm a victim of this, and they live their life through this lens, and it's tough to get out of it because if the people around them are like, oh yeah, you're PTSD, and so this is how we're going to treat you. You're going to put you in this box, and then you lived in that box and you can't get out of it because then people are thinking of you in those terms, and then you believe like, oh, I'm just victim, and then that's how I kind of read the selfishness of that that condition, right?
Yeah, I'm not a fan of that at all, and I don't really allow that in my house. And it's funny because like running an organization, I have a lot of volunteers that will give me a lot of excuses about things, and people who don't know me well will always, well, I've got this and I've got that, and I have tons and tons of like physical health issues, a ton, and I just don't. Like, I just suck it up if I need to suck it up. And my family's got a lot of, like, mental health issues. And if they've committed to something, I'm like, you've committed to something. And it's just one of those things where it's not an excuse. Like, it's something that you have. It's, it's part of you. But it's so funny. And there's times where, like, that we have something important coming up, like, with the organization. And I'll post, like, in our Facebook group. And I'll be like, I do not want to hear one single sob story because I guarantee mine will be worse than yours. So everybody just zip it. You just be there and everyone will laugh because I'm like, you know what? Like, I'm just quiet about it. Like, I'm just like, you know what? This is just a thing. Or I'll meet new caregivers that are in an abusive situation. They'll be like, but I can't leave because I don't have a job and I don't have money and I'm like, you know what? I left an abusive marriage with no job and no work experience and no college education and 3 little kids, and I did fine. Like, I didn't go on government assistance, and I got a job and I found a house, and and they're like, oh, I'm like, yeah, like, bring it on, because you know what? I'm not a believer in just, having people feel sorry for me and use excuses. It's like, if you need to get something done, you just get it done. And so part of me feels like I'm a jerk for that, but the other part of me sees like I have 3 really strong kids, even though like they have mental illness issues and things like that. A couple of them do. Like, I see that they're just like, my daughter's in her 3rd semester at school and struggling, but she just keeps trying and keeps going. And she has a lot of friends that have dropped out, and she's just pushing through, and she's just like, she's not going to let it stop her. She's like, I will graduate. Like, I'm going to make it happen, whatever it takes. And it's just that where it's never been an excuse. And, and there was resilience. It really is, because I just taught them that. I'm like, it doesn't matter. Like, yeah, we all have bad stuff happen to us. And most people that would meet my kids and they'd be like, oh, I'd have no idea that they have this. And I'm like, because I'm not going to let them be like all weird and awkward. Like, they're going to afterwards be like, oh my gosh, that was so scary. But in the moment, they're going to appear to be normal humans. And, and I'm going to suck it up and go through things, and afterwards be like, oh my gosh, my hip is killing me. But I'm not going to be like, oh, my hip hurts, so I'm not coming today. And it's just one of those things where I'm like, we don't use excuses. And my husband will try to sometimes be like, I can't do this. And I'm like, we committed, like, you're going to be there, buddy. Yeah. And so it's tough it out. Yeah. And my daughter, one time, she had to do something scary for school. And so she decided to do a Facebook Live on my Facebook, which has like, I think I'm almost at 5,000 friends, of letting people ask her questions of what it's like to be a teenager with mental illness. And so people like gave her all these questions, and people would ask her like, well, with you being bipolar, sometimes do say things like to your mom or something that's mean, and then later you take it back. And she's like, first off, mental illness is not an excuse to be mean to anyone. And I would never do something like that and blame it on my mental illness. And I was like, this is my child that I raised, because these things are not an excuse. PTSD is not an excuse for abuse, and being bipolar is not an excuse to be a jerk to someone. And that's just, it's something that I don't think that we should get to use things as excuses.
Right.
Like,
on a good note, to kind of wrap things up, what is your message to whoever's listening to this right now, and where can they find out more information about you and engage in whatever fashion, whether support or just learn? Where can they find you and learn more about what you do and engage?
Okay. So message, I guess my biggest thing is, veterans. I know I've talked a lot about caregivers, but I sure love our veterans, and definitely support anything that you can with veterans and with their families, like anything. Right. They definitely, like, their entire families, they take a lot on for our country, and I feel like it's something that our country needs to step it up in giving back to those families. They take a lot of, like, whatever your political leanings are, whatever you feel about war, like whatever you feel about our country, our veterans have shouldered a lot for us. And that's something, if you get the chance to donate to a good nonprofit, if you get the chance to give service hours to whatever it is, to a veterans organization, to a caregiver organization, do it, because, they sacrificed not only in their service, but afterwards, a lot of them for the rest of their lives afterwards, and their families are sacrificing. And I think that all of our country needs to step it up more in realizing that it's not just the service members that are serving, but it's afterwards what they're giving for forever, for the rest of their lives. And so I feel like our country needs to shoulder more of that burden and take more of that on.
Thank you for saying that. Yeah. That's so true. And where can people find you and engage with you?
So I can be found Facebook, Angie Toone. I'm really easy to find. BattlinBetties.org is our national website. We also have a Utah Platoon page on Facebook. So I think it's just Battlin Betties Utah Platoon. We post all kinds of fun stuff, where we're going to be, what we're doing, a lot of silly memes about military vet. We realize that's how we get them to follow our page, and then we can post the good stuff about, like, mental illness stuff and where we're going to be. So I also have an Instagram, American Homemaker. So,
all right.
Yeah.
Well, great. Thank you for being on the show. Really appreciate it. You definitely enlightened and gave me perspective on what's happening outside of my little domain of knowledge. And hopefully those who are listening to this will take some of that information and run with it. So really appreciate you on the show. Thank you so much for being here.
Yeah. Thank you for having me.